The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the polished wooden floor as I stepped into the foyer of St. Ignatius Catholic School. The scent of old books and incense hung in the air, mingling with the faint echoes of distant footsteps. I paused for a moment, taking in the grandeur of the building. High vaulted ceilings soared above me, adorned with ornate chandeliers that glimmered in the soft light. It was a far cry from the cozy kindergarten classrooms I was used to, but there was something undeniably captivating about the place. "Welcome to St. Ignatius, Miss Amelia," a voice called out from behind me. I turned to see a middle-aged woman approaching, her smile warm and welcoming. She introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson, the school's principal, and ushered me into her office. "It's a pleasure to have you join our team," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "I've heard wonderful things about your work with young children." I thanked her, feeling a flutter of nerves in my stomach. This was my first day at St. Ignatius, and the unfamiliar surroundings left me feeling slightly out of place. As Mrs. Thompson briefed me on my responsibilities and introduced me to the other staff members, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered at the back of my mind. There was something about the school that felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Just give yourself some time to settle in, dear," Mrs. Thompson reassured me, noticing my apprehension. "I'm sure you'll feel right at home in no time." I nodded, forcing a smile as I glanced around the office. There was a framed photograph on Mrs. Thompson's desk, depicting a group of teachers and students gathered outside the school. Among them was a familiar face, my late Uncle Henry. "Is something wrong, Miss Amelia?" Mrs. Thompson asked, following my gaze. I hesitated, unsure if I should mention Henry's connection to the school, but something told me that his presence here was more than just a coincidence. I couldn't help but notice the photograph. I said, pointing to Henry's smiling face. "My uncle. He used to teach here too." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Ah, yes. Henry was a beloved member of our faculty. His passing was a great loss to us all." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. Henry had always been fascinated by the supernatural, and his sudden death had been shrouded in mystery. I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his connection to St. Ignatius than met the eye. But as Mrs. Thompson continued to speak, my thoughts were soon consumed by the tasks that lay ahead. As the newest member of the St. Ignatius family, I had a classroom to prepare and a new group of students to welcome into the fold. Little did I know, my journey at St. Ignatius was only just beginning, and the mysteries that awaited me would test not only my courage but also my sanity. After my first day at St. Ignatius, I found myself drawn to the stack of old boxes in the corner of my apartment. They contained the remnants of my Uncle Henry's life, his journals, his research notes, and the letter that had brought me to this eerie school in the first place. With a sense of trepidation, I pulled out the worn envelope and carefully unfolded the letter inside. Henry's handwriting was neat and precise, each word imbued with a sense of urgency. "Dear Amelia," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. But there are things you need to know, things about St. Ignatius that I couldn't bring myself to tell you before." As I read on, my heart pounded in my chest. Henry spoke of strange occurrences at the school, of whispers in the shadows and voices calling out from the darkness. He urged me to uncover the truth, to delve into the mysteries that had haunted him until his dying day. But it was the final paragraph that sent a chill down my spine. "I fear that there are forces at work in St. Ignatius that are beyond our understanding," Henry wrote. "Be careful, Amelia. Trust no one, and remember that the truth may be more terrifying than you could ever imagine." I sat back, the letter clutched tightly in my trembling hands. Henry had always been fascinated by the supernatural, but I had never imagined that his obsession would lead him to such dark places. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved deeper into Henry's research, scouring his journals for any clue that might shed light on the mysteries of St. Ignatius. But the more I read, the more questions arose, and the more I began to doubt my own sanity. It was then that I heard a knock at the door, pulling me from my thoughts. With a sense of unease, I rose to answer it, half expecting to find some malevolent force lurking on the other side. To my relief, it was just my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, a kindly old woman who lived down the hall. "Amelia, dear, I thought I heard voices coming from your apartment," she said, peering at me with concern. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, trying to shake off the sense of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. "I'm fine, Mrs. Jenkins," I replied, "just doing a bit of unpacking. That's all." But as she turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. Closing the door behind her, I returned to Henry's letter, the words burning themselves into my mind. "Trust no one," he had said. But how could I uncover the truth of St. Ignatius without risking everything I held dear? With a heavy heart, realized that my journey into the darkness had only just begun, and that the secrets of St. Ignatius were far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The days at St. Ignatius passed in a blur of activity and apprehension. Each morning, I would arrive at the school with a sense of trepidation, unsure of what new horrors awaited me within its walls. But it was the whispers in the hallways that haunted me the most, the faint murmurs that seemed to echo from the very depths of the building. As I made my way through the empty corridors one afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavy, charged with an electric energy that sent shivers down my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to envelop me at every turn. But no matter how fast I walked, the whispers followed, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. It was as if the very walls themselves were alive with the echoes of the past, urging me to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within the shadows. Lost in my thoughts, I nearly collided with Mrs. Thompson, who was hurrying down the hallway with a stack of papers in her arms. "Apologies, Miss Amelia," she said, her brow furrowed in concern. "I didn't see you there." Forced a smile, trying to shake off the sense of unease that gripped me like a vice. "No harm done, Mrs. Thompson," I replied, my voice sounding hollow in the empty corridor. But as she continued on her way, I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes darted nervously from side to side, as if she too could sense the malevolent presence that lurked within the shadows. As the day wore on, the whispers grew louder, their words becoming clearer with each passing moment. I strained to make out what they were saying, but their voices were distorted, their meaning lost in the cacophony of sound. It was then that I heard a soft sobbing coming from one of the nearby classrooms. Curious, I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, I found a young girl sitting alone at her desk, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I asked, kneeling down beside her. The girl looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of the whispers outside. Something in the shadows." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to her words. Whatever was haunting St. Ignatius, it seemed that it was growing bolder by the day. But as I tried to comfort the young girl, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both in grave danger, and that the whispers in the hallways were just the beginning of the horrors that awaited us within the walls of this cursed school. The sun hung low in the sky as I watched the children play in the schoolyard, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. But despite the idyllic scene before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I kept a watchful eye on the children, I noticed a group of them gathered around the swings, their expressions filled with a mixture of fascination and fear. Curious, I made my way over to investigate. "What's going on here?" I asked, kneeling down beside them. One of the children, a young boy named Tommy, pointed a trembling finger at the swings. "They're moving by themselves," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, puzzled by the strange occurrence. The swings swayed back and forth, their chains creaking ominously in the stillness of the afternoon. "It must be the wind," I said, trying to reassure the children. But even as the words left my lips, I knew that something far more sinister was at work. As if on cue, the merry-go-round suddenly sprang to life, spinning wildly without anyone pushing it. The children gasped in horror, backing away as if afraid it might swallow them whole. I felt a surge of panic rising within me as I realized that whatever was haunting Street Ignatius had now turned its attention to the playground. Desperate to protect the children, I herded them back into the safety of the school, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as we sought refuge indoors, I couldn't shake the feeling that the malevolent force that lurked within the shadows was growing stronger by the minute. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave for the day, I couldn't help but glance back at the deserted playground outside. In the fading light of dusk, it seemed to take on an otherworldly aura, as if the very ground beneath it was cursed. As I hurried home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the day were just the beginning of something far more sinister, and that the haunted playground was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the horrors that awaited me at Street Ignatius. Determined to unravel the mysteries of Street Ignatius, I delved deeper into Henry's research, scouring through his old journals and poring over dusty archives in search of answers. Each day brought new revelations, each clue leading me further down the rabbit hole of the school's dark history. One afternoon, as I sifted through a stack of yellowed documents in the school's archive room, I stumbled upon a faded map dated back to the early 19th century. It showed the land upon which Street Ignatius now stood, but marked with something chilling, the outline of an ancient Native American graveyard. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the implications of this discovery. Could it be that Street Ignatius was built upon sacred ground, disturbed by the settlers who had come before? It seemed that the whispers in the hallways, the haunting on the playground, were all connected to the restless spirits of those who had been laid to rest beneath the school's foundations. Lost in thought, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a voice behind me. "Finding anything interesting, Miss Amelia?" Mrs. Thompson asked, peering over my shoulder. Quickly composed myself, hiding the map from view as I turned to face her. "Just doing a bit of research on the school's history," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's fascinating stuff." Mrs. Thompson nodded, though I could sense a hint of unease in her demeanor. "Be careful, dear," she said, her voice tinged with caution. "Some things are better left buried." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of urgency that burned within me. There were secrets hidden within the walls of Street Ignatius, secrets that needed to be brought to light no matter the cost. As the days passed, I continued to unearth more clues, piecing together the puzzle of Street Ignatius' dark past. It seemed that there had been a string of disappearances among the female teachers over the years, each one more mysterious than the last. Rumors swirled about foul play and supernatural intervention, but the truth remained elusive. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon mention of a black raven mask that everything began to fall into place. According to legend, the mask was cursed by the spirits of the dead, its wearer consumed by darkness and driven to madness. As I gazed upon the crude sketches of the mask in Henry's journal, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was the key to unlocking the mysteries of Street Ignatius, and that confronting the malevolent force behind the hauntings would be the only way to bring an end to the horrors that plagued the school. The discovery of the black raven mask sent chills down my spine, its ominous presence casting a shadow over my thoughts. According to Henry's research, the mask was said to be cursed by the spirits of the dead, its wearer doomed to be consumed by darkness. As I pored over the ancient texts and faded manuscripts, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mask held the key to unlocking the mysteries of Street Ignatius. But with that knowledge came a sense of dread, a fear of what lurked in the shadows. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, the mask resting on the table before me like a macabre artifact, there was a knock at the door. With a sense of trepidation, I rose to answer it, my heart pounding in my chest. To my surprise, it was Father Michael, the school's priest, a concerned look etched upon his weathered face. "Miss Amelia, may I come in?" he asked, his voice grave. I nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. There was something in his demeanor that set me on edge, a sense of urgency that hung heavy in the air. "Is everything all right, Father?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, as if unsure of how to proceed. "I've heard rumors about your investigations into the school's history," he said finally, his gaze never leaving mine. "I must warn you, Miss Amelia, some truths are better left buried." I felt a surge of anger rising within me at his words. How could he stand there and dismiss the suffering that had plagued St. Ignatius for so long? "With all due respect, Father, I cannot ignore the suffering that has plagued this school," I said, my voice tinged with frustration. "There are forces at work here that must be confronted, no matter the cost." Father Michael's expression softened, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I understand your desire to uncover the truth, Miss Amelia," he said, his voice gentle, "but be careful. The darkness that lurks within the shadows is far more powerful than you can imagine." With that, he turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the cursed raven mask that seemed to mock me from across the room. But despite Father Michael's warnings, I knew that I could not turn back now. The truth of St. Ignatius was within my grasp, and I would stop at nothing to uncover it, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. The disappearance of Mrs. Johnson weighed heavily on my mind as I delved deeper into the dark history of St. Ignatius. According to Henry's research, she had been a beloved teacher at the school, known for her kindness and dedication to her students. But one day, she had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. Determined to uncover the truth, I sought out those who had known Mrs. Johnson, hoping to glean some insight into her mysterious disappearance. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room of Mrs. Johnson's former colleague, Mrs. Roberts, retired teacher who had worked at St. Ignatius for over 30 years. "Tell me about Mrs. Johnson," I asked, my voice quiet with anticipation. Mrs. Roberts sighed, her eyes clouded with sadness. "She was a wonderful teacher," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "Always willing to go the extra mile for her students. But after her husband passed away, she seemed different, distracted, almost. And then one day, she just vanished." I listened intently as Mrs. Roberts recounted the events leading up to Mrs. Johnson's disappearance, each word sending a chill down my spine. It seemed that there was more to this case than met the eye, and that Mrs. Johnson's fate was intertwined with the dark forces that plagued St. Ignatius. As I left Mrs. Roberts' house later that evening, my mind was racing with questions. What had happened to Mrs. Johnson? And was there a connection between her disappearance and the hauntings that had plagued the school for so long? Lost in thought, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a voice behind me. "Miss Amelia, wait." I turned to see Father Michael hurrying towards me, his expression grave. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Mrs. Roberts," he said, his voice urgent. "Be careful, Miss Amelia. Some truths are better left buried." I felt a surge of frustration rising within me at his words. How could he stand there and dismiss Mrs. Johnson's disappearance as if it were nothing? "With all due respect, Father, I cannot ignore the suffering that has plagued this school," I said, my voice tinged with anger. "There are forces at work here that must be confronted, no matter the cost." Father Michael's expression softened, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know that you seek the truth, Miss Amelia," he said, his voice gentle, "But be careful. The darkness that lurks within the shadows is far more powerful than you can imagine." With that, he turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the lingering mystery of Mrs. Johnson's disappearance. But despite Father Michael's warnings, I knew that I could not turn back now. The truth of St. Ignatius was within my grasp, and I would stop at nothing to uncover it, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. The air was thick with tension as I stood before the looming facade of St. Ignatius, the black raven mask clutched tightly in my trembling hands. It was time to confront the malevolent force that lurked within the shadows, to bring an end to the hauntings that had plagued the school for so long. With a deep breath, I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The whispers that had haunted me for weeks seemed to grow louder with each passing moment, urging me forward into the heart of darkness. As I made my way through the labyrinthine corridors, I could feel the weight of centuries of suffering pressing down upon me. But despite the fear that gnawed at my insides, I refused to back down. I had come too far to turn back now. It wasn't long before I reached the heart of the school, a dimly lit chamber at the center of the building. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and writhing like specters from another world. And there, standing before me, was the source of the darkness, a figure cloaked in shadow, its eyes gleaming with malevolence. "You dare to defy me, mortal," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I squared my shoulders, steeling myself against the fear that threatened to consume me. "I am not afraid of you," I said, my voice steady despite the terror that pulsed through my veins. "You may have haunted this school for centuries, but your reign of terror ends here and now." With a flick of my wrist, I donned the black raven mask, its cold embrace sending a shiver down my spine. But as its power coursed through me, I felt a surge of strength unlike anything I had ever known. The malevolent force before me recoiled, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "You cannot defeat me, mortal," it snarled, its voice filled with fury. But I refused to back down. With every ounce of determination I possessed, I unleashed the full force of the mask's power, banishing the darkness from St. Ignatius once and for all. As the last echoes of the malevolent force faded into nothingness, collapsed to my knees, the weight of my ordeal finally catching up to me. But as I looked around at the now silent chamber, I knew that my journey was far from over. For even though I had confronted the malevolent force behind the hauntings, the scars it had left upon St. Ignatius would linger for years to come. And as I made my way out of the school, the black raven mask clutched tightly in my hand, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of this cursed place. With the malevolent force banished from St. Ignatius, I knew that my only chance of survival was to escape the haunted halls that had become my prison. Every step I took seemed to echo through the empty corridors, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on my shoulders. As I made my way towards the exit, a sense of unease settled over me. It was as if the very walls themselves were watching me, waiting to drag me back into the darkness from which I had just escaped. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, sending a chill down my spine. "Miss Amelia, wait." Turned to see Father Michael hurrying towards me, his expression filled with concern. "You cannot leave, Miss Amelia," he said, his voice urgent. "The darkness still lingers within these walls. It is not safe." I hesitated, torn between the desire to escape and the fear of what lay beyond the safety of St. Ignatius. "But I have to go," I said, my voice trembling. "I cannot stay here any longer." Father Michael's expression softened, his eyes filled with understanding. "I understand your desire to leave, Miss Amelia," he said, his voice gentle, "but be careful. The darkness that once haunted this school may still be lurking in the shadows." With that, he stepped aside, allowing me to pass. As I made my way out of the school, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a part of myself behind, that the horrors of Street Ignatius would haunt me for the rest of my days. But as I emerged into the light of day, a sense of relief washed over me. I had escaped the clutches of the malevolent force that had threatened to consume me, and now it was time to bring the truth to light. With the black raven mask clutched tightly in my hand, I made my way towards the authorities, ready to tell them everything I had uncovered about the dark history of Street Ignatius. And though I knew that the school would forever be haunted by its past, I took solace in the knowledge that I had done everything in my power to bring an end to the horrors that had plagued it for so long. As I stood outside Street Ignatius, the weight of its dark history pressing down upon me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Though I had escaped the clutches of the malevolent force that had haunted the school, its lingering presence still hung in the air like a thick fog. With a heavy heart, I turned away from the imposing facade of the building, knowing that the horrors of Street Ignatius would continue to haunt me long after I had left its shadowy halls behind. As I made my way home, my mind raced with thoughts of everything I had uncovered during my time at the school. The disappearances, the whispers, the cursed raven mask, they were all pieces of a puzzle that had haunted me for weeks, and yet there were still so many questions left unanswered. Lost in thought, I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a voice behind me. "Miss Amelia, wait." I turned to see Mrs. Thompson hurrying towards me, her expression filled with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. I forced a smile, trying to push aside the memories of the horrors I had witnessed at Street Ignatius. "I'll be fine, Mrs. Thompson," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just the school. It's like it's haunted by its past." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I know, dear," she said, her voice gentle, "but sometimes the past is best left behind us. All we can do is move forward and try to make things right." Her words struck a chord within me, and I nodded, knowing that she was right. The horrors of Street Ignatius would always be a part of me, but I refused to let them define me. As I made my way home, the weight of the black raven mask still heavy in my hand, I knew that my journey was far from over, but with each step I took, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, knowing that I had faced the darkness head-on and emerged stronger for it. And though Street Ignatius would forever be haunted by its past, I took solace in the knowledge that I had done everything in my power to bring the truth to light, and that the darkness that once lurked within its walls would never again hold sway over those who walked its halls.